When I look back on my childhood, it feels like a storm that never quite passed. My earliest memories are fragmented, but they all share one thing in common: struggle. My mom was only 20 when she had me, and my biological father. He didn't stick around long enough for me to even form a memory of him. From what little she told me later, he bolted the moment she gave him an ultimatum: stay or leave. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just gone. And with his departure came not just the absence of a parent, but also the crushing weight of financial instability. We lived in this tiny apartment above my grandparents' garage, a space so cramped that you could practically touch both walls if you stretched your arms out wide. It wasn't much, but it was home, or at least, it was supposed to be. The truth is, life back then wasn't just about making ends meet, it was about surviving day by day. Money was tighter than a vice grip, and every single decision felt like walking a tightrope over a bottomless pit. There were nights when the cupboards were almost bare, and mornings where breakfast consisted of whatever scraps we could scrape together. But perhaps the most vivid memory from those early years, the one that still haunts me to this day, is the time I caught my mom crying silently as she held her wedding ring in trembling hands. She thought I was asleep, but I saw everything. That ring, once a symbol of hope and love, became nothing more than collateral damage in our fight against poverty. The next morning, there was milk on the table. I didn't understand it fully at the time, but now I know. She sold it. Sold her own wedding ring, something deeply personal and irreplaceable, just to ensure I wouldn't go hungry. It's strange how moments like these shape you without you realizing it. Back then, I was too young to comprehend the gravity of what she did. All I knew was that there was food on the table and clothes on my back. But looking back now, I see the sheer desperation in her actions, the lengths she went to keep me alive. It wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about survival. Every choice she made came with a cost, and while I admired her resilience, I couldn't help but wonder how much of herself she lost along the way. Her laughter grew quieter, her smiles rarer, and her eyes carried a sadness that no amount of effort could mask. Yet, despite everything, she kept moving forward. She juggled schoolwork, part-time jobs, and raising me, all while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. To say she worked hard would be an understatement. She worked tirelessly, often staying up late into the night studying or working extra shifts just to make ends meet. But even amidst all the chaos, there were fleeting moments of warmth. My grandparents played a huge role in keeping us afloat during those years. They weren't just caregivers, they were lifelines. My grandfather, especially, took me under his wing. He taught me how to ride a bike, shared stories about his youth, and always reminded me that tough times don't last forever. Storms pass, he'd say, his voice steady and reassuring, and for a while, I believed him. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker loomed ahead. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. After my mom married Leonard, the subtle shifts in our household began to take shape, but it wasn't until much later that I realized how profoundly they would alter my life. At first, everything seemed fine, or at least tolerable. Leonard wasn't cruel or abusive. He simply existed as a distant figure, polite but detached. He didn't go out of his way to include me, nor did he actively exclude me. It was more like I had become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of their new family dynamic. But what truly stung was the growing distance between me and my own mother. Before Leonard entered the picture, there were moments when she still made time for me despite her busy schedule. She'd read bedtime stories, ask about school, or even laugh with me over some silly inside joke we shared. Those small gestures mattered. They reminded me that no matter how hard things got, I was still her child, still important. But after the wedding, those moments became fewer and farther between. The dinners we used to have together disappeared entirely. What replaced them were hurried meals where conversation revolved solely around Leonard's workday or plans for their future, plans that never included me. One incident stands out vividly in my memory, a moment that felt like the final nail in the coffin of our once close relationship. I was 14 then, and I had just received my report card, an achievement I was incredibly proud of. Straight A's across the board, along with glowing comments from teachers who praised my dedication and potential. For weeks leading up to it, I had poured every ounce of energy into studying, sacrificing sleep and free time to ensure I excelled. When I finally held that piece of paper in my hands, I couldn't wait to show it to my mom. Deep down, I hoped it might remind her of the son she used to cherish, the one she used to make time for. That evening, I found her in the kitchen, leaning against the counter while scrolling through her phone. Her face lit up slightly when I walked in, but it dimmed almost instantly when I handed her the report card. "Mom," I said, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the excitement in my voice, "I got straight A's." She glanced at the paper briefly before setting it aside without so much as a smile. Then came the words that cut deeper than any blade. "That's nice, sweetheart, but I'm busy right now." Busy, as if my accomplishments were nothing more than an interruption to her day. I stood there frozen, staring at her, waiting for something, anything that might indicate she cared. But all I saw was indifference. Her eyes returned to her phone, her fingers tapping away as though nothing significant had happened. In that moment, I felt like I didn't exist, not just to her, but to anyone. My chest tightened, and a lump formed in my throat. I wanted to scream, to demand why she couldn't spare a single second to acknowledge my hard work. Instead, I turned and walked away, clutching the report card in trembling hands. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling utterly abandoned. It wasn't just the lack of praise that hurt, it was the realization that I had been relegated to the background, overshadowed by Leonard and the impending arrival of the twins. Every decision, every action, seemed designed to push me further out of the picture. Family dinners gone, heart-to-heart conversations non-existent. Even the little traditions we used to share, like baking cookies on weekends or watching movies together, faded into oblivion. It was as though I had ceased to be part of the family altogether. Looking back now, I understand that my mom wasn't deliberately trying to hurt me, at least, not consciously. She was caught up in building a new life with Leonard, preparing for the twins, and navigating her own struggles. But understanding doesn't erase the pain. If anything, it magnifies it. Knowing that she chose to prioritize others over me, knowingly or not, left a void inside me that nothing could fill. I tried harder to win back her attention, pouring myself into academics, helping around the house, and doing everything I could think of to prove my worth. Yet, no matter what I did, it never seemed to matter. The worst part was the silence, the deafening quiet that settled between us whenever we were in the same room. It wasn't just physical distance, it was emotional abandonment. And while Leonard may not have directly contributed to this shift, his presence loomed large, casting a shadow over whatever fragile connection remained between my mom and me. By the time I turned 16, I knew beyond a doubt that I was no longer a priority in her life. The breaking point came soon after, when she and Leonard sat me down to deliver the news that would change everything. They couldn't afford to support me anymore. The night everything changed was etched into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. It wasn't just the culmination of years of neglect. It was the moment I realized how disposable I had become in their eyes. By then, I was 16, old enough to understand the gravity of what they were about to do, but too young to fully grasp how it would shape the rest of my life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the living room, my mom and Leonard called me into the space where family conversations were supposed to happen. But this wasn't a conversation, it was an ultimatum. I remember walking in, sensing the tension before anyone even spoke. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. Leonard sat stiffly on the couch, his arms crossed, while my mom perched beside him, her hands clasped tightly together as if she were trying to hold herself from crumbling. They didn't ask me to sit. Instead, Leonard launched straight into it, his tone clipped and devoid of any warmth. "We've been doing some calculations," he began, his voice carrying the cold precision of someone delivering bad news without remorse. "With the twins getting older, expenses are piling up faster than we anticipated. We simply can't afford to support everyone under this roof anymore." My heart sank, though part of me had seen this coming. For months, maybe even years, I'd felt the walls closing in around me, the subtle dismissals, the growing indifference. Still, hearing those words out loud made my stomach churn. My mom remained silent, staring at her lap, refusing to meet my gaze. She looked smaller, somehow diminished, as though the weight of her decision had already drained her of whatever fight she might have once had. But then Leonard leaned forward, his expression hardening further. "You're old enough now," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "It's time for you to take responsibility for yourself." Responsibility, the word echoed mockingly in my head. At 16, I was still a child who had spent years trying desperately to earn their approval, to prove I wasn't a burden. And yet here they were, casting me aside like yesterday's trash. I opened my mouth to protest, to beg them to reconsider, but Leonard cut me off before I could utter a single syllable. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he snapped, his patience visibly fraying. "You need to leave. Tonight." Tonight. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood frozen, my mind racing as panic clawed its way through my chest. Leave? Where was I supposed to go? To my grandparents' house. Sure, they loved me, but they were retired, living on a fixed income. Could they really take me in? Would they want to? All these questions swirled in my head, but what terrified me most was the finality in Leonard's voice. There was no room for negotiation, no second chances. This was it. And then came the threat, the one that shattered whatever fragile hope I still clung to. "If you don't leave willingly," Leonard said, his tone icy and unyielding, "I'll call the police. You'll be trespassing." His words hung in the air like poison, sharp and suffocating. My breath hitched, and tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. How could he say that? How could my own mother sit there silently while he threatened to treat me like a criminal in my own home? Without waiting for a response, Leonard gestured toward the staircase. "Go pack your things. Now." His command left no room for argument. I turned and stumbled upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hands trembled as I shoved clothes into a duffel bag, grabbing random items: a toothbrush, a few books, a photo of me and my grandpa fishing. Every item felt insignificant, meaningless, like pieces of a life I was being forced to abandon. The tears streamed freely now, hot and relentless, as I moved mechanically through the motions. Was this really happening? Was I truly being thrown out because I was no longer convenient? When I returned downstairs, my mom finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that night. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw regret flicker across her face, but it vanished almost instantly. She didn't say a word, not to apologize, not to explain, not even to wish me luck. Nothing. As I stepped out the door, dragging my bag behind me, I couldn't stop the flood of questions swirling in my mind. Did she ever love me? Had I ever mattered to her at all? Or was I just another obligation, something to check off her list until she found something or someone better? Standing on the porch, I took one last look at the house that had once been my home. Then, with trembling legs and a heart full of unanswered questions, I walked away, unsure if I would ever find my place in the world again. The weight of my reality hit me hardest during my senior year of high school. I had spent countless nights poring over textbooks, determined to excel academically despite the chaos that surrounded me. My grades were solid straight A's and glowing recommendations from teachers who saw potential in me, but beneath the surface of success lay a gnawing fear. How would I afford college? Without financial support from my mom or Leonard, the dream of higher education felt like an impossible mountain to climb. Scholarships were competitive, loans required co-signers, and every door seemed to close before I could even knock. I tried reaching out to my mom once, late at night when desperation clawed at my chest. Sitting in my grandparents' dimly lit kitchen, I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, rewriting the same text message over and over again. "Hey, I've been accepted to a few colleges. Do you think you can help with financial aid stuff or co-sign a loan?" It sounded pathetic, but it was all I had. When I finally mustered the courage to press send, relief washed over me briefly until her reply came hours later. "We're saving for the twins' future. We can't help, sorry." Just 3 sentences, cold and dismissive, as if my dreams didn't matter at all. When I finally mustered the courage to press send, relief washed over me briefly until her reply came hours later. "We're saving for the twins' future. We can't help, sorry." Just 3 sentences, cold and dismissive, as if my dreams didn't matter at all. It was one of those brutal winter evenings where the wind howled like a wounded animal, and rain lashed against everything in its path. I had taken up a delivery job after school to cover some of my expenses, a grueling task made worse by the weather. That night, I was scheduled to deliver packages across town, a route that stretched farther than usual because of last-minute orders. Clad in a thin jacket and soaked sneakers, I pedaled furiously through sheets of rain, my bike tires splashing through puddles as lightning illuminated the dark sky. About halfway through my route, disaster struck. My bike chain snapped with an ear-piercing screech, leaving me stranded on a desolate road miles away from home. Panic surged through me as I realized the implications: no backup transportation, no nearby shelters, and 5 kilometers still ahead of me. The clock was ticking. I needed to complete the deliveries to earn enough money for next semester's tuition deposit. There was no room for failure. With trembling hands, I flipped the bike upright and began pushing it forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The rain soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, while gusts of wind threatened to knock me off balance. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I'd lose everything: the chance to escape this life, to prove that I was worth something. Tears mingled with rainwater streaming down my face, blurring my vision as I trudged along the empty road. At one point, a car sped past, spraying water onto me. I shouted in frustration, my voice drowned out by the storm. For a fleeting moment, I considered giving up, dropping the bike, and collapsing right there. But then I thought about my grandpa, who always told me storms pass eventually. He believed in me even when others didn't. His words echoed in my mind, fueling the fire inside me to keep going. By the time I reached my final destination, I was drenched, shivering, and utterly exhausted. My legs burned, my hands were raw from gripping the handlebars, and my spirit felt battered. As I handed over the last package, the customer looked at me with pity, offering a towel and a cup of hot tea. I declined politely, too proud or maybe too broken to accept kindness. All I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget the world existed. That night, lying awake in the darkness, I replayed the events in my head. Each pedal stroke, each push forward, had reinforced a painful truth: I was alone. No one was coming to save me, not my mom, not Leonard, not anyone. This realization should have crushed me, but instead, it ignited a fierce determination within. If no one else would fight for me, I would fight for myself. And though the road ahead promised more hardship, I resolved to face it head-on, one step at a time. By the time I turned 30, life had finally started to pay me back for all the years of relentless hustle. After clawing my way through college on loans and side gigs, working late nights while others partied, and sacrificing every ounce of comfort just to stay afloat, I found myself sitting in an office chair with senior manager engraved on my nameplate. It wasn't handed to me, it was earned, drop by drop, sweat by sweat. But success never comes without its challenges, and mine arrived in the form of a scandal that nearly derailed everything I'd worked so hard to build. It happened during one of the most critical projects of my career, a high-stakes client proposal that could make or break our department's reputation. For weeks, I poured my heart into it, meticulously reviewing every detail, coordinating with multiple teams, and ensuring nothing slipped through the cracks. The presentation went flawlessly, or so I thought. A day later, chaos erupted. One of my colleagues, Greg, stormed into the conference room where we were debriefing, slamming a report onto the table. "This is your fault," he barked, his voice dripping with accusation. Apparently, there was a major error in the financial projections section, a mistake so glaring that the client threatened to pull out entirely. And according to Greg, I was responsible. My stomach dropped as everyone turned to stare at me. Their eyes weren't curious, they were accusatory, like vultures circling their prey. My mind raced. I hadn't touched the financials. They were handled by Greg's team, but when I opened my mouth to defend myself, no one listened. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, whispers filled the hallways, painting me as incompetent, reckless, even dishonest. Even some of my closest coworkers began distancing themselves, afraid of being tainted by association. The pressure mounted. My boss called me into his office, his expression grim. "If this blows up," he said, leaning forward, "it's not just your job on the line, it's the entire project." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. All those years of grinding, of proving myself after being thrown away by my own family, felt like they might crumble in an instant because of someone else's mistake. But instead of crumbling, something inside me ignited. This wasn't just about saving my career, it was about showing them who I really was. I spent the next 48 hours locked in a conference room, dissecting every single document related to the proposal. Coffee cups piled up around me, my eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I refused to stop. Piece by piece, I traced the error back to its source and discovered something shocking. The faulty numbers hadn't been an accident, they were deliberately altered, and the digital trail led straight to Greg's computer. He had sabotaged the project not out of malice, but out of fear. Afraid of underperforming, he had fudged the figures to cover his tracks, only to pin the blame on me when things unraveled. Armed with evidence, I walked into a meeting with senior leadership, ready to fight for my integrity. As I laid out the facts, pointing out inconsistencies, and presenting screenshots of the tampered files, the atmosphere shifted. Greg squirmed in his seat, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. When questioned directly, he cracked, confessing everything in front of the entire team. Silence fell over the room as the truth sank in. What should have been a disaster became a turning point. Not only did I save the project, but I also earned the trust and respect of my superiors. Within months, I was promoted to a higher managerial role, overseeing larger teams and more complex initiatives. Looking back, that scandal taught me more than any textbook ever could. It reinforced the importance of resilience, of standing firm when the world seems determined to knock you down. More importantly, it reminded me of how far I'd come from the boy who once pedaled through rainstorms to deliver packages, to the man who now commanded boardrooms. Every challenge I faced, every betrayal, every hardship had shaped me into someone uncheckable. Success wasn't just about titles or paychecks. It was about knowing I had fought tooth and nail to get here, and no one could take that away from me. It was a day I never saw coming, one that shattered whatever fragile piece I had built for myself. Just when I thought my past was finally behind me, the ghosts of my childhood came crashing back through my front door. It started with an unexpected knock, a sound so ordinary, yet it sent a chill down my spine. Peering through the peephole, I froze. Standing there were my mom and Leonard, two people I hadn't seen in years. My stomach churned as I reluctantly opened the door, but I didn't step aside to let them in. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight with suspicion. Leonard didn't bother with pleasantries. He shoved past me like he owned the place, his presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. My mom followed silently, her eyes avoiding mine. "We heard about your promotion," Leonard began, his tone sharp and accusatory. "So, you're finally doing something with yourself. Good for you." "About time, really." His words hit like daggers, each syllable laced with venom. I stared at them, stunned by their audacity. No congratulations, no small talk, just straight to insults. Then my mom jumped in, her voice trembling with desperation. "The twins are starting college soon, and we've hit a rough patch financially. We figured since you're doing so well now, you could help out with their expenses." My mind reeled. After years of silence, after everything they'd put me through, throwing me out, abandoning me, they had the nerve to show up at my door demanding money. "Are you serious?" I managed to choke out, my voice rising. "Why wouldn't we be?" Leonard shot back, his expression smug. "You're making good money now, aren't you? Don't act like you can't afford it. You don't have kids. You don't have a family to take care of. You've got the money. It's not about whether I can afford it," I snapped, my fists clenched at my sides. "It's about the fact that you two have done absolutely nothing for me. And now you're standing here asking for a handout like I owe you something." My mom rolled her eyes, throwing her hands up in exasperation. Oh, here we go again. You're going to play the victim. Hi. Poor you. We didn't coddle you enough. Well, look at you, you turned out fine. Yeah, because I worked my ass off, I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. I made it happen without any help from either of you. Do you have any idea how hard it was to get through college without a cosigner, without financial support? I did it in spite of you, not because of you. Leonard smirked, leaning closer. Oh, come on. Stop acting like you had it so rough. You've got a good job now, don't you? A nice place to live. Maybe you should be thanking us. If we hadn't pushed you out, you wouldn't be where you are today. That comment struck a nerve deeper than anything else. Thanking you, I repeated, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. You threw me out because I wasn't convenient anymore. You made it clear I didn't matter to you. And now you're here expecting me to swoop in and save the day for the kids you actually cared about. Absolutely not. Leonard stepped even closer, his face hardening. You know what your problem is. You've always thought you were more important than you actually are. You think you're better than everyone else just because you made it out on your own. But let me tell you something, you didn't mean anything to this family then, and you don't mean anything now. His words hit like a sledgehammer, knocking the air out of me. For a moment, I felt dizzy, the room spinning around me. The betrayal, the sheer cruelty of their words, it was too much to bear. How could they stand there, accusing me of selfishness while demanding I sacrifice everything for the siblings they cherish? When I finally found my voice, it was cold and steely. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. Leonard scoffed. Go ahead, call them. See how that looks, throwing your own parents out of your house. You're not my parents, I said firmly, my finger hovering over my phone. Not anymore. The nightmare didn't end with that confrontation at my apartment. If anything, it only escalated from there. My mom and Leonard were relentless, refusing to accept my rejection of their demands. What started as an uncomfortable knock on my door soon spiraled into a full-blown invasion of my life, both personal and professional. I thought I had drawn a clear line when I told them they weren't welcome in my space, but boundaries meant nothing to them. They saw me as nothing more than a resource, someone who owed them something because of blood ties. One day, the storm hit where I least expected it, my workplace. It was a typical Tuesday morning, and I was buried under a mountain of reports, preparing for an important meeting with senior leadership. The office buzzed with its usual energy, keyboards clacking, phones ringing, conversations flowing softly in the background. Then, out of nowhere, chaos erupted. A loud voice pierced through the calm, sharp enough to make everyone freeze mid-task. Where is he? She screamed, her tone dripping with fury. Heads turned toward the entrance, where my mom stood, red-faced and trembling with rage. She marched straight into the open-plan office like a hurricane unleashed, ignoring the startled looks of my colleagues. Her eyes locked onto mine, blazing with accusation. How dare you ignore your family? She bellowed, pointing a finger at me as if I were on trial. After everything we've done for you, you ungrateful brat. We gave you life, and this is how you repay us. By turning your back on your own flesh and blood. Every word felt like a punch to the gut, not just because of what she said, but because of where she said it. Dozens of pairs of eyes were glued to me, wide with shock and curiosity. Some whispered behind their hands, others simply stared, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. My face burned with humiliation as I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about her anger, it was about her tearing me apart in front of people I respected, people whose opinions mattered to my career. I tried to keep my composure, stepping forward cautiously. Mom, I hissed, lowering my voice, you can't do this here. Please leave. But she wasn't listening. She ranted louder, accusing me of being selfish, heartless, and undeserving of success. You think you're so high and mighty now, don't you? She spat, her voice echoing off the walls. But let me tell you something, you wouldn't be where you are today if it weren't for me. And now you refuse to help your own siblings. That's disgusting. By then, HR had been alerted, and security guards appeared at the scene. One of them gently approached her, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," he said firmly but politely. But she swatted his hand away, screaming even louder. "Don't touch me, he's my son. Don't act like you care about him more than I do." The entire floor fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. It took nearly 15 minutes and multiple attempts by security to escort her out of the building. As she left, she threw one final insult over her shoulder. "You'll regret this, mark my words." The moment the doors closed behind her, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. My chest tightened, my palms grew clammy, and for a second, I thought I might pass out. Later that afternoon, my boss called me into his office. His expression was unreadable as he asked me to explain what had transpired. I stumbled through my response, apologizing profusely while trying to assure him that this wouldn't happen again. Thankfully, he seemed understanding at least for now, but the damage was done. Rumors spread like wildfire, and for weeks afterward, I could feel the lingering stares and hushed whispers whenever I walked past. The incident left me questioning everything. Was I safe anywhere? Could I ever truly escape her? Throughout my life, the people who truly stood by me weren't blood relatives in the traditional sense. They were my grandparents and my aunt. They became my anchors when the rest of the world felt like it was spinning out of control. My grandparents, especially my grandpa, had always been my safe haven. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, cheered me on during school events, and reminded me that I wasn't alone, no matter how hard things got. And my aunt, she didn't just step in when I needed financial help for college. She believed in me when even I doubted myself. Her faith in my potential gave me the courage to keep pushing forward. But there was a moment, a terrifying, heart-stopping moment that made me realize just how much they cared, and how deeply my struggles affected them. It happened during one of our regular Sunday dinners at my grandparents' house. These dinners were sacred to us, a tradition we never broke, even after everything fell apart with my mom. That evening, as we sat around the table, laughter filling the air, I finally decided to open up about what had been going on between me and my mom. Up until then, I had kept most of it hidden, not wanting to burden them with my problems. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them everything, the way she threw me out, her refusal to support me financially, and now her relentless attempts to guilt-trip me into paying for the twins' education. The room grew eerily silent as I spoke, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. My grandma covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears welling up in her eyes. But it was my grandpa's reaction that shook me to my core. His face turned red, veins bulging on his forehead as he clenched his fists tightly. "How could she do this?" he roared, slamming his hand on the table so hard that the dishes rattled. "Her own son, after everything we've done for her." Before anyone could respond, his expression suddenly changed. His face went pale, and he clutched his chest, gasping for breath. "Dad!" my aunt screamed, rushing to his side. Panic erupted in the room as we realized what was happening. He was having a heart attack. My stomach churned as I watched him collapse into the chair, his breathing labored and uneven. We called an ambulance immediately, and within minutes, paramedics arrived, rushing him to the hospital. Sitting in the sterile waiting room, guilt consumed me. This was all my fault. If I hadn't kept quiet about what was happening, maybe he wouldn't have been blindsided by such intense anger. Why did I think hiding my pain would protect them? All I had done was add another layer of suffering to their lives. When the doctor finally came out to tell us he was stable, relief washed over me, but it didn't erase the shame I felt. Later that night, as I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his frail hand, he opened his eyes and looked at me. "You're my grandson," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "Don't ever think you're alone in this fight. We're your family, not her, not Leonard." His words hit me like a tidal wave, breaking down the walls I had built around myself. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully accept the love and support they offered, without feeling like a burden. Months after the chaos with my mom and Leonard had finally settled, I thought I'd closed that chapter of my life for good. The restraining order was in place, and I had built walls so high around myself that I believed nothing and no one could penetrate them. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone after a long day at work, a notification popped up, and a known number had sent me a text. "Hey, it's Max. Can we talk? You're my brother, and I don't know you at all." My stomach tightened instantly. Max, one of the twins. The same twins who had been the center of my mom's universe, the reason she cast me aside without a second thought. For years, I had convinced myself they were part of the problem, extensions of her selfishness and neglect. But now, here was one of them reaching out to me. At first, suspicion clouded my mind. Was this some new scheme orchestrated by my mom? A ploy to guilt-trip me into giving them money? I stared at the message for what felt like hours, debating whether to ignore it or respond. Finally, curiosity got the better fist of me. "What's this about?" I replied curtly, keeping my guard up. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was a call from the same number. My heart raced as I hesitated, but something compelled me to answer. "Hey," came a voice on the other end, tentative, almost nervous. "I know this is random, but I wanted to reach out. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, and I feel like I missed out on something important. You're my brother, and I don't know anything about you." His words caught me off guard. There was no trace of manipulation in his tone, just raw honesty. Still, skepticism lingered. "Why now?" I asked sharply. "Why reach out after all these years?" He paused before responding, his voice softening. "Honestly, because I don't want us to be strangers forever. I'm not asking you to forgive Mom or Dad, and I'm not making excuses for them. I want to know you. That's it." His sincerity was disarming, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely. Over the next few days, we exchanged texts sporadically. Each conversation felt like walking a tightrope. I wanted to believe him, but fear of betrayal held me back. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived at my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small gift wrapped neatly in brown paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. "Dear Ethan Carter," it began. "I know I can't undo the past, and I can't change what Mom and Dad did to you. But I want you to know that I see you. I see how hard you've worked to build your life, and I admire that. This isn't much, but I saved up for months to get you something special. It's your birthday next week, right? I hope you like it. If you never want to talk to me again after this, I'll understand. But I just wanted to try." The gift was simple, a leather-bound journal, but the weight of the gesture hit me like a tidal wave. Here was someone who didn't know me anything, yet he had gone out of his way to show kindness. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized how wrong I had been to lump him together with my mom and Leonard. Max wasn't responsible for their actions. In fact, he seemed determined to distance himself from them. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to entertain the possibility of connection. Not because I trusted him completely, not yet, but because his effort felt genuine. He hadn't tried to guilt me or justify their behavior. Instead, he had taken a step toward reconciliation, however small. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding what had been broken. In the end, life had a way of teaching lessons that no book or lecture ever could. After years of carrying the weight of rejection, betrayal, and loneliness, I finally came to understand what family truly meant. It wasn't about blood, it was about connection, love, and unwavering support. And it took one quiet Sunday afternoon, surrounded by the people who had always stood by me, to drive that truth home. It started as an ordinary day, a small gathering at my grandparents' house, something we did often but never took for granted. My grandpa sat in his usual spot on the porch, sipping coffee while watching the leaves fall from the old oak tree. My grandma bustled around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch. My aunt laughed with Max, who had become a regular presence in our lives over the past few months. He wasn't just one of the twins anymore. He was someone trying to rebuild what had been broken, step by cautious step. We were all seated around the table when my grandpa cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. His voice was steady, but there was a depth to it that made us pause. "You know," he began, looking directly at me, "family isn't defined by whose DNA runs through your veins. Family is where they accept you not because you're perfect, not because you succeed, but because you belong." His words hung in the air like a melody, resonating deep within me. For a moment, silence enveloped the room. Then, without warning, tears welled up in my eyes. They spilled over before I could stop them, streaming down my face uncontrollably. All the pain, anger, and longing I'd buried inside for so long came rushing to the surface. I felt exposed, raw, yet strangely safe. Here I was, surrounded by people who didn't judge me for my failures or envy me for my successes. They simply loved me for who I was. Max reached across the table and placed a hand on mine. "I'm sorry for everything," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I can't change the past, but I want to be better for you, for me, for everyone here." His apology wasn't just for himself. It was for the years of neglect, the missed opportunities, and the fractures caused by others. My grandma wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, sniffling softly. "We should have done more," she admitted, guilt heavy in her tone. "When your mother threw you out, we thought keeping peace was enough. But it wasn't. You deserved so much more than we gave you." "No," I interrupted, shaking my head firmly. "You gave me everything. Without you, I wouldn't be here today. You taught me resilience, strength, and how to find light even in the darkest moments. That's what family does. They lift you up when the world tries to push you down." As the conversation continued, I realized this moment wasn't just about healing old wounds, it was about forging new bonds. The scars would always remain, but they no longer defined me. What mattered now was the future, the relationships I chose to nurture, the love I allowed myself to receive, and the legacy I wanted to leave behind. By the time dessert was served, laughter filled the room again. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood that perfection wasn't the goal. Love was, acceptance was, and in that realization, I found peace.